In October 1962, the world unknowingly stood closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other moment in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not a sudden explosion of chaos, but a slow-burning confrontation driven by fear, miscalculation, and the terrifying logic of Cold War power politics. At its core, it was a crisis of perception and survival, unfolding between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each armed with weapons, capable of destroying civilization itself. The discovery that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, sent shockwaves through Washington. These were not symbolic weapons. They were capable of reaching major U.S. cities within minutes, drastically shifting the strategic balance. For President John F. Kennedy and his advisors, the situation represented an intolerable threat, one that demanded immediate action, yet offered no safe options. Any move risked triggering a nuclear exchange. Airstrikes could provoke retaliation. An invasion could escalate into full-scale war. Doing nothing could signal weakness and invite further aggression. The pressure was immense and time was brutally short. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev viewed the missile deployment as a defensive necessity. The United States had already placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, aimed directly at the Soviet Union, and American hostility toward Fidel Castro's revolutionary government in Cuba was no secret. From Khrushchev's perspective, placing missiles in Cuba was both a strategic equalizer and a deterrent against another U.S.-backed invasion of the island. What neither side fully grasped at first was how fragile the situation truly was. Communication was slow, intelligence incomplete, and assumptions filled the gaps where certainty did not exist. Military forces on both sides moved to high alert. Nuclear weapons were armed, and commanders prepared for scenarios that, once initiated, could not be undone. Ordinary citizens went about their daily lives unaware that decisions being debated behind closed doors could determine whether the world would survive the month. These 13 days were defined not by explosions, but by restraint, by tense meetings, coded messages, and moments where a single misjudgment could have erased cities. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a standoff over weapons. It was a confrontation with the reality of nuclear power and the terrifying responsibility that came with it. It revealed how close humanity could come to self-destruction and how thin the line truly was between survival and catastrophe. The tension intensified rapidly once American reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what intelligence analysts had feared for weeks. High-altitude U-2 spy planes captured unmistakable images of Soviet medium and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites under construction across Cuba. These photographs transformed suspicion into undeniable reality. Inside the White House, President Kennedy convened an emergency group of senior officials, later known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. What followed was a relentless series of debates marked by fear, urgency, and uncertainty. Military leaders overwhelmingly favored decisive force, massive airstrikes, followed by a full invasion of Cuba to eliminate the missile threat once and for all. From a purely tactical standpoint, it seemed logical. But Kennedy understood that military logic did not exist in a vacuum. Any attack on Cuba risked Soviet retaliation elsewhere, particularly in Berlin, a city already divided and volatile. More dangerously, it risked nuclear escalation. The president demanded options that would neutralize the threat without igniting a war that no one could win. As discussions dragged on, the clock continued to tick. Soviet ships carrying additional missile components steamed toward Cuba, while U.S. naval forces mobilized in the Atlantic. The United States raised its military readiness level to DEFCON 2, the highest ever reached in history, placing strategic bombers armed with nuclear weapons on constant airborne alert. Missile crews sat underground with launch keys within reach, awaiting orders that everyone prayed would never come. Meanwhile, the American public was finally brought into the reality of the crisis when Kennedy addressed the nation on television. Calm but resolute, he announced the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba and declared a naval quarantine to prevent further weapons from reaching the island. The word was carefully chosen. Calling it a blockade would have legally constituted an act of war. The announcement stunned the world. Families gathered around radios and televisions, some rushing to build fallout shelters, others preparing for the unthinkable. Across the globe, U.S. allies braced for conflict, while adversaries watched closely for signs of weakness or resolve. In Moscow, Khrushchev was furious and alarmed. The quarantine challenged Soviet credibility and placed him in a dangerous corner. Turning back, ships could appear as surrender. Pushing through could spark open conflict at sea. Messages between Washington and Moscow grew longer, more emotional and increasingly personal, revealing the strain on both leaders. Each side attempted to interpret the other's intentions through incomplete signals, knowing that a single misreading could trigger catastrophe. Beneath the surface, events grew even more dangerous. The tension reached its most dangerous point when the crisis moved from secret discovery to global confrontation. After President Kennedy decided to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba, the world held its breath as American warships took positions across the Atlantic, ordered to stop and inspect Soviet vessels heading toward the island. This was no symbolic gesture. Any miscalculation at sea could ignite open war between two nuclear superpowers. Soviet ships continued sailing, their intentions unclear, while U.S. commanders waited with weapons armed and orders that allowed deadly force. Meanwhile, American cities prepared for the unthinkable. Fallout shelter plans were discussed openly. Military bases went on high alert, and nuclear bombers circled in the sky around the clock. Inside the White House, Kennedy and his advisors debated every hour, weighing military strikes against the risk of provoking a nuclear response from Moscow. On the other side of the world, Nikita Khrushchev faced immense pressure not to appear weak, knowing that backing down could shatter Soviet credibility, yet pressing forward might end civilization itself. Public speeches grew sharper, diplomatic cables more urgent, and both nations signaled readiness for war while desperately hoping to avoid it. Each move was layered with uncertainty. No one knew if a commander might act on instinct, if a radar error could be mistaken for an attack, or if a single shot could spiral into full nuclear exchange. The crisis was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time, with millions of lives hanging on decisions made in windowless rooms, under crushing pressure where fear, pride, and responsibility collided in the most perilous standoff the modern world had ever seen. Behind closed doors, both leaders worked tirelessly to find a way out of the abyss. President Kennedy and his closest advisors explored every option to neutralize the missile threat without triggering a nuclear war. Diplomacy became as crucial as military readiness, and backchannel communications were initiated to test the Soviet response. Khrushchev, meanwhile, faced the same impossible dilemma. Withdrawing missiles would be politically costly at home, yet escalation could lead to mutual destruction. Over 13 days, both sides engaged in a delicate dance of messaging, threats and concessions, carefully calibrated to avoid outright provocation while signaling resolve. The world watched unknowingly. As global markets wavered and international leaders grew anxious about what might come next. Every letter, every phone call, and every public statement carried immense weight. A single misstep could ignite a catastrophe that no human effort could undo. American intelligence continued to monitor missile sites with precision, tracking their construction and deployment, while Soviet forces prepared for contingencies in Cuba. The crisis highlighted the razor-thin margin between war and peace, revealing how human judgment, timing, and restraint were as vital as technology in the nuclear age. Ordinary citizens were largely unaware that civilization itself teetered on the edge, but the reality was stark. The superpowers were a single miscalculation away from a global catastrophe. In these tense hours, diplomacy and measured action proved more powerful than aggression, showing that even at the height of fear, careful calculation and communication could prevent disaster. Ultimately, it was the commitment to restraint, combined with backchannel negotiations, that steered both nations away from the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a defining moment in modern history, a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be and how critical leadership and patience are when the stakes are nothing less than survival. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as one of the most dramatic examples of diplomacy, strategy, and courage in modern history. After 13 days of unrelenting tension, a carefully negotiated agreement emerged. The Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba, while the United States secretly pledged to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy at a later date. This deal, balanced delicately between public firmness and private compromise, prevented what could have become a catastrophic nuclear exchange. It also underscored the profound importance of communication, intelligence, and measured judgment in a world armed with weapons, capable of obliterating entire populations within minutes. Beyond the political and military maneuvering, the crisis left an enduring lesson for leaders, military strategists, and citizens alike. The greatest weapon in preventing total destruction is often restraint. Throughout those 13 days, the thin line between war and peace was maintained not by superior firepower alone, but by the ability of two leaders to recognize the stakes, control their impulses, and seek solutions that avoided escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis fundamentally changed how the United States and the Soviet Union approached nuclear strategy, leading to the establishment of direct communication links, arms control agreements, and a heightened awareness of the perils of miscalculation. For the world, it became a defining cautionary tale. The presence of nuclear weapons magnifies every decision, every message, and every misunderstanding. Yet it also demonstrated that careful planning, persistent intelligence, and measured leadership can avert disaster even in the most perilous moments. Ultimately, the 13 days of October 1962 serve as a reminder of the fragility of peace, the weight of responsibility borne by leaders, and the enduring necessity of vigilance, communication, and restraint in a world where the consequences of error are unthinkably high. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a confrontation over weapons. It was a profound test of human judgment, strategy, and the ability to protect a world on the edge of annihilation.